The biggest mortgage collapse in U.S. history just entered phase 2. And I need to explain to you what that means because what's happening right now in 2026 is actually worse than what we saw in 2008 on several key metrics. Buyer demand has now cratered to the lowest level ever recorded. We just got the January pending home sales data and it came in at 70.9. That is the lowest reading in the entire history of that index going back to 2010. The NAR's own chief economist is now calling this a new housing crisis. And folks, the Fed has already cut rates 6 times, 175 basis points of cuts. And it has done absolutely nothing to bring buyers back. But here's what we really want to break down for you today because this is what nobody else is talking about. Number 1, we're going to show you the specific data on how many homeowners are now underwater on their mortgage and which cities are getting hit the hardest. Because some of these numbers are genuinely alarming. Number 2, we're going to show you why the Northeast and Midwest, the markets that everyone thinks are safe right now, might actually be the next domino to fall. And number 3, we're going to explain to you exactly what phase 2 means and why it's fundamentally different from what we've been experiencing the last 3 years. So let's get into it. All right, everyone, let's start with the demand picture because this is what sets the stage for everything else. According to the National Association of Realtors, existing home sales in January 2026 fell to a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 3.91 million units. That was down 8.4% from December, the sharpest monthly drop in nearly 4 years. And to put that in context, at the peak in 2021, we were doing 6.73 million annualized sales. So we've seen a 42% decline from peak buyer demand. And what makes this different from previous downturns is how long it has lasted. We are now in year 4 of record low buyer demand. If you go back decades, we have never seen demand this depressed for this long. Even in 2008, the downturn was sharper, but it was briefer. This is a slow grind that just keeps getting worse. The forward-looking data is even more concerning. Pending home sales, which measures signed contracts, just hit 70.9. That's 20% below where we were in January 2011, in the middle of the housing crisis aftermath. Think about that. Worse forward-looking demand right now than during the Great Recession recovery. Homes are sitting on the market for 62 to 66 days in January 2026, the slowest January pace in a decade compared to 36 days in January 2022. And as of September 2025, 70% of all U.S. listings had been sitting for 60 or more days without going under contract. In Miami, 84.6%. In Austin, 82.8%. When more than 8 out of 10 listings can't find a buyer after 2 months, that's a market in serious trouble. And why is demand this low? Because affordability is completely out of control and nothing the Fed has done has fixed it. The national median existing home price in January 2026 was $396,800, a record for the month of January. Home prices are now 5 times median household income nationally, according to NAHB. The historical norm was 3.2 times income. At the 2006 bubble peak, we were at 5.5 to 7 times, so we're right back in that danger zone. The typical monthly mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, is running between $2,559 and $2,768, depending on whose data you use. And according to Redfin, the income you need to afford the median home is $111,252 a year. The actual median household income is about $83,150. That's a gap of almost $28,000. The typical American family literally cannot qualify for the typical American home. So first-time buyers have been completely shut out. Their share of purchases dropped to a record low of 21%, down from a historical norm of 40%. The median age of a first-time buyer just hit an all-time high of 40 years old. All cash purchases hit an all-time high of 26% of sales. The only people buying are people who don't need a mortgage. Now here's where the Fed comes in. The Federal Reserve has cut rates 6 times since September 2024, bringing the federal funds rate from 5.5% down to 3.75%. That is 175 basis points of cuts. And the 30-year mortgage rate has barely moved. It was around 6.5% when cuts started. Today, it's 6.01% per Freddie Mac. After the first 3 cuts, rates actually went up and surpassed 7% in January 2025. JP Morgan now says they don't expect any further cuts in 2026. The Fannie Mae Home Purchase Sentiment Index fell to 71.6 in February, its first year-over-year decline in 2 years. 78% of consumers say it's a bad time to buy. Builder sentiment sank to 36, the 22nd consecutive month below 50. The Fed is not going to save this housing market. The problem isn't rates. The problem is prices are too high. Now, let's get into the negative equity data I promised you, because this is where Phase 2 really comes together. According to the February 2026 ICE Mortgage Monitor, 1.1 million borrowers ended 2025 underwater on their mortgage. That's the highest since early 2018 and represents 2.1% of all mortgages. At the start of 2025, there were 696,000 underwater borrowers. So in 1 year, the number jumped 58%. And there's another 3.2 million borrowers with less than 10% equity. A very thin cushion. If prices drop another 5 to 10% in their market, millions more go underwater. Over 90% of currently underwater homeowners bought between 2022 and 25. These are people who bought at or near the peak. And Cotality reported total borrower equity declined by $373.8 billion, with the average homeowner losing $13,400 in a single year. Here's where it's concentrated. Lakeland, Florida, 10.8% underwater. Cape Coral, 10.1%, with values down 13% from peak. Austin, 9.2% underwater, and now 27.8% below its 2022 peak. San Antonio, 8.8%. Tampa, 5.4%. Colorado Springs, 5.6%. But here's the really alarming part. In Cape Coral, nearly 70% of 2023 and 24 vintage FHA loans are underwater. In Austin, 65% of 2022 vintage FHA loans are underwater. These are buyers who put the least money down and they are getting destroyed. Now, I know some of you will say the negative equity rate is still way below 2008. And you're right. At the peak, it was 23 to 26%, about 11.1 million homeowners. We're at 1.1 million. But in 2005 and 2006, before the crash accelerated, the numbers were low too. It always starts as a drip in specific markets and specific loan vintages. Then it spreads. We are clearly in the early innings of that pattern. Real quick, if this market intel is helping you make better decisions, hit that notification bell. We drop new housing data every week, and the viewers who catch it first get the best opportunities. The bell ensures you see everything immediately, not days later when the market's already moved. And you could see this playing out in actual prices across the country. 1/3 of U.S. housing markets are now declining. 100 of the 300 largest metros are posting year-over-year drops. Northport, Sarasota, Florida is the worst nationally, down 8.6 to 8.9%. Austin is down 5 to 6.3%. Tampa down 3.6 to 3.9%, with 13 consecutive months of annual declines. Phoenix down 2.2%, with nearly 87% of homes losing value. Denver down about 2%, with 91% of homes losing value. The Florida condo market is in full-blown crisis. The median condo price dropped 8.1% year over year, the biggest decline since 2010. Inventory exploded 35 to 37%. Post-Surfside legislation requires structural inspections for buildings 30 years or older, affecting 900,000 of Florida's 1.5 million condo units. Special assessments of $20,000 to $50,000 per unit are becoming common, and over 1,400 condo associations are on Fannie Mae's financing blacklist. And the inventory numbers tell you everything about why these markets are in trouble. Florida has 202,157 homes for sale, 42% above 2019 levels, with 8 months of supply. Texas has 151,769 homes, 48% above 2019, with 7 months of supply. sellers are capitulating. 34.2% of listings nationally have taken price cuts. The typical buyer paying below asking is getting a 7.9% discount, the largest since 2012. And 62% of all buyers are paying less than list price. Meanwhile, sellers who refuse to cut are just pulling their homes off the market. Delistings surged 28% year over year. In Miami, there were 59 delistings for every 100 new listings. According to Redfin, there are now 37.2% more sellers than buyers, the largest gap in their records going back to 2013. So the Sun Belt is clearly correcting. The data on that is overwhelming at this point. But here's what's interesting, and this is the second thing we promised you at the top. The markets that everyone thinks are safe right now, the Northeast and the Midwest, we're starting to see warning signs there too. On the surface, these markets look great. Chicago led the Case-Shiller Index at plus 5.7%. New York up 5%. Hartford, Connecticut was named the #1 hottest market for 2026. And the reason is simple. Inventory there remains 40 to 60% below 2019 levels. But here's the concern. These markets are becoming increasingly overvalued while still losing population. New York lost 137,000 net domestic migrants in 2025. New Jersey and Massachusetts are still losing people. Illinois lost 40,000. So prices are going up in markets that are shrinking. Are we saying they're going to crash tomorrow? No. Inventory is too tight for that. But looking out 12 to 18 months, buying into a significantly overvalued market that's losing population is risky. The contrast is stark. Austin is 27.8% below its 2022 peak, while Hartford is 21.2% above its 2022 peak. Those trends will eventually converge. So let me tie this all together and explain what Phase 2 actually means. Phase 1 was the freeze. That's what we experienced from 2023 through most of 2025. Buyers stopped buying, but sellers also stopped selling. Transaction volume collapsed, but prices stayed elevated because there was no inventory. Sellers could wait because they had 3% mortgage rates. It was a standoff. Phase 2 is what's happening now, and it's fundamentally different. Phase 2 is when sellers start being forced to act, and several forces are converging to create this pressure. First, the lock-in effect is fading. The share of mortgages above 6% now exceeds the share below 3%. Owners who bought in 2022 through 2025 are paying 35 to 40% of their income. When life events happen, they cannot afford to sit. They have to sell. Second, negative equity is spreading. 1.1 million underwater, 3.2 million with less than 10% equity. As these homeowners sell at losses or go to foreclosure, it adds inventory, pushes prices down further, and puts more people underwater. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. This is exactly what happened in 2007 and 2008. Third, there is a wall of debt coming due. Over $930 billion in commercial real estate loans mature in 2026. 60% of the most distressed apartment loans come due in the second half of 2026. Forced sales are coming. Fourth, and I think this one is underappreciated, the migration engine that powered Sunbelt housing demand has completely stalled. Florida went from 310,000 net domestic movers in 2022 to just 22,000 in 2025. Let that number sink in. That is a 93% collapse in the number of Americans moving to Florida. Alabama now has higher net domestic migration than Florida. Texas fell 70% from 222,000 down to 67,000. And it's not just domestic migration. The Census Bureau reported that net international migration to the U.S. dropped 54% and is projected to fall even further. So you've got Sunbelt markets that built a massive amount of housing during the boom, priced it at very elevated levels, and now the flow of people moving in has dried up. Without people, you can't sustain these prices, period. Fifth, foreclosures are accelerating. Filings were up 14% nationally in 2025. FHA delinquency hit 11.52%, the highest since 2021. FHA loans account for 52% of all seriously delinquent mortgages and 80% of the rise in foreclosures. The distress is hitting lower income and first-time buyers hardest, and Treasury Secretary Besson himself stated the housing market is in a recession. Phase 2 is the shift from a frozen market to a forced selling market. The drip of price cuts is turning into a stream of foreclosures, short sales, and desperate reductions. Record low pending sales, a 58% jump in underwater borrowers, FHA delinquency at 11.52%, foreclosures surging 50 to 88% in the hardest hit metros. The data is clear. Now look, I'm not trying to tell you every market in America is crashing. If you're in Hartford, Rochester, or Chicago, those markets are still supply constrained. But if you're in Florida, Texas, Arizona, or Colorado, you need to understand what's happening. Prices are dropping, negative equity is rising, foreclosures are accelerating, and 6 rate cuts have done nothing. If you're a seller in one of these markets and you actually want to sell, price aggressively now. Waiting has cost sellers in Austin 27.8% since 2022. Every month you wait is potentially a lower price. If you're a buyer, be patient and be smart. Understand the data in your specific market before you make a move. The decisions you make in the next 12 months could save you or cost you tens of thousands of dollars. This is not the time to guess. This is the time to know your numbers. We're in phase 2 now, and we're going to be covering every twist and turn as this plays out. If you're not subscribed with notifications on, you're going to miss critical updates that could affect your buying or selling decisions. Hit that bell, drop a comment telling us what market you're watching, and I'll see you in the next one.